as part of the conversation. It's not always just what is the best for the environment. It has to be balanced, just as that traditional triple bottom line. So I like to put this slide up to start for a lot of our workshops, and it's a reminder as the last 10 years there's been this boom in solar farming all over the United States, including Massachusetts, and I like to remind folks that every year and every day farmers are solar farmers. Whether you're growing grass, whether you're growing winter squash like this, you have these plants that are sort of going to facilitate energy capture from our environment, and if we can do a good job as growers, we can kind of capitalize on that, both to improve the soils that we're working with, but also to create something that people can enjoy in their kitchen. Here's a picture of last summer, and I include this because sometimes, in any photo opportunities, you like to present your best and brightest, and I think it's useful for folks to know that, we're not talking about a system here when we talk about soil testing and using mineral balancing and fertility decisions. It's not necessarily a cure-all. It's exemplified by this great picture of our cucumbers last August and being, taken down by downy mildew. You can see the healthy squash and zucchini and tomatoes and lettuce in the photo as well. So this isn't necessarily going to say that there's never problems on the farm, but we can hopefully get to a place where our production year in, year out is pretty consistent. For the consumers, they really, they don't see what goes into growing an onion. So, we're going to talk a little bit about some of those steps tonight around fertility, but the end game for them is, is this something that's fair priced? Does it taste good? Does it nourish their bodies? And one of the things that informs the work that we do is to make sure that what we're growing does do all of those things, and especially from a nutritional standpoint. So we might emphasize when we end the conversation tonight talking a little bit about nutritional quality. Oh, somebody's coming in and saying there's no photos, so let me come back here and check in with Anna. One second. Apologies for that. Thank you for jumping in, Linda and Anna. All right, sharing my screen. Can we see photos now?
I can see it.
Yeah, I don't know why. So I was going through a few spots where there was no photos. So
it was just your title page, but we see onions now.
All right, let's come back. Oh, here's this picture of those beautiful squash plants. And thank you, the downy mildew there, sliding the cucumbers. I'm going to get rid of this. Whoops. Come back here. All right. So, yeah, definitely jump in if you can't see photos or at any point something disappears on me. So here's the picture from last summer, the cucumber plants that obviously look decimated by downy mildew, the zucchini and the tomatoes and lettuce and dill, going strong. So, again, reminder, we're not solving every problem with our fertility program and the aforementioned onions. So, yeah, a question I had for folks are, what soil labs are people using? And there's a lot of different opportunities out there. And, we think of soil testing as a tool for making informed fertility decisions. And a lot of people like to ask us, how frequently are we pulling soil tests? And I typically say, we pull soil tests when we want to find some piece of information that's going to help us make a decision on the farm. And some years that might be multiple times throughout the growing season. Some years it might be in the springtime. Some years we skip a year because we're not making any, big strategic changes to our fertility program, and we feel like we can kind of just plow ahead. But as a general rule, it's a tool to help you make informed fertility decisions. And we will talk a little bit about some of the different labs and what those tests will give you. But as a general rule, for most veg fields, you're going to till those fields, you're going to sample the top 6 inches of the soil, which sort of is considered to be the active aerobic zone, and it's where most of your biological activity is happening during the growing season, and it's certainly where probably has the most impact from a nutrient standpoint.
Okay, this is actually why I thought I was talking to the person who is going to be joining.
We have a little bit of audio feedback. I don't know if Anna can catch that or not. All right. So in terms of selecting a soil lab, the two that are most commonly used by growers in our network is, probably heavily influenced by the work that Dan Kittredge has done through the Bionutrient Food Association, is the University of Massachusetts Soil Lab. They use a modified Morgan extraction, which is considered to be a weak acid, and that test has been around for a long time and has been kind of well considered for use in this region because it sort of approximates what root systems can get throughout the growing season. Over the years, Dan and others have turned a lot of people on to using Logan Labs out in Ohio for their Malic-3 extraction, which is a stronger acid than what you see with the University of Massachusetts soil test. And the differences there can be pretty significant. And I sometimes like to think of it as the Logan Labs test. The strong acid is, if you think of it in terms of bank accounts, it is the checking account or the account of nutrients that your plant might be able to get over the course of the season or using biological activity, whereas the UMass test will maybe give you a more idea of what your cash flow is like. One of the advantages to using the Malic-3 test is if you're interested in looking at some of the trace minerals that are maybe less commonly tested, especially the kind of micro traces like cobalt, molybdenum, selenium, silicon, you can have that done as part of their Malic-3 test, and all of it's about $30, so it's not too expensive. The way the different soil labs have kind of found into their place is, they've done these research trials over the years, and they get together, New England does it, the Midwest does it, all the different labs get together and they talk about what testing parameters are giving them the best results. And one of the ways they do this is by looking at kind of a yield regression analysis. And here's a picture of something from a publication that came out maybe about 6 or 7 years ago. And it's looking at soil phosphorus, and at what point does a soil phosphorus on a test do you see a yield response. And this is really sort of what informs the approach to the modified Morgan that UMass uses, which is it looks at in-field studies, and they say, do they get a result if they fertilize with phosphorus? Well, they do. Yep. Oh, everybody's coming back to me and saying that we're still on the mildew slides. Or try again. So, Anna, I'm not sure it's going to get there, but for some reason when I'm going through, maybe I sometimes lose people through my slides, and I'm not quite sure why that is. But you're going to see these coming back to you now. And
okay, that's fine. It could be the way that you're advancing.
Let me try one other option. Let's see here. All right, well, it still says I'm sharing my screen, so I'm going to assume we're back in good shape. I apologize again. So
yeah, we're viewing your screen.
We're even stuck here in cucumber land, and I continue to go forward. So there are links there to the Malic-3 and the UMass soil labs. So if people want information how to get those soil tests, I'm not going to talk too much about how to pull soil samples. All that information is well covered online. What I really want to get into is why you might choose one lab or the other and what you're going to learn from those choices. So here's the yield regression analysis that I spoke of, looking at phosphorus and at what level is the phosphorus in the soil critical from a yield perspective. One of the keys for me on this is it doesn't really enter the conversation when we look at quality. It's often just looking at straight volumetrics, and so the argument might be for a Malic analysis is a lot of people who are pursuing quality sometimes are looking for something with greater information, not just looking at what gives you the top yield. So that's a picture of that my green beans. Ultimately, what our customers are interested in is the flavor and the taste. And what we're interested in is how can we produce the flavor and the taste in an economical and sustainable way. And, this idea of soil testing, there's a lot of different approaches, and I'm not going to get bogged down into every single one, but I just kind of want to highlight a couple of those things. And over these next few slides, I've linked, and you have access to these after tonight, for the people who are academically inclined, you can kind of go and look at the Cornell information in terms of choosing a lab for phosphorus or so on and so forth. The labs that you choose, typically they're going to be chosen because you have some sort of philosophical relationship with how they approach growing food. And the modified Morgan test that UMass uses is a good test. I don't think because it doesn't use a strong acid, it doesn't necessarily give you an idea of what might be biologically available down the road. It kind of gives you more of a snapshot of what's going to be available right there in the growing season. I think a lot of their yield tests were done using conventional agricultural trials, and so I sort of struggle with how much do they perfectly line up with organic practices where there's probably a stronger and heavier emphasis on the biological aspect of growing food. So a slew of different labs, and again, we're not going to highlight each one of these, but they're linked for people to go back to. This last slide here has some of the tissue testing laboratories, so if you want to get into not just soil testing, but want to look at the end game in the height of the season. As we talk about soil testing, and sometimes it's a little bit dangerous to get a piece of paper. It seems quite official from a lab, and it's going to say you have this, deficiency, or you have this excess. And I think it's really critical that we keep in mind that, these soil tests are done in a lab. It's a relatively small sample. It's typically a snapshot in time. And, they need to be used in conjunction with our footsteps and our observation and the time that we spend kind of getting to know and reading the field and figuring out, some of the places where you might have problems and so on and so forth. And so I think of them, it's not exactly a fair analysis, but, if you go outside, today was in the 50s today in Dartmouth, you look at a thermostat as you walk into the greenhouse, and it helps kind of hone your observation and say, yes, it is 70 degrees in this greenhouse right now. And I think of that to some degree with soil testing is you over time can start to learn to read the field through looking at the crops, looking at the soil, and the soil test can give you kind of information to help you as you kind of learn through those observation skills. So I want to work through a couple of slides here and talk about some of these observation skills and then, how they might play out in a soil test. And the pictures here, hopefully people have them on the screen and they can, scale them up big enough so you can see what we're talking about. I don't have a pointer per se, but I suppose I can put my little arrow. But this is a picture of our cilantro that we put into our tunnel a little over a week and a half ago. We have a window of time where we're going to sneak some cilantro in before we get our summer tomatoes into these beds. And we have a whole slew of different greens and stuff, and we're bringing some flavor in. And, I pulled this plug out and just took a photograph, and I think it's really nice to look at because what I see here is the root systems are growing quite nicely. We haven't actually irrigated any of these transplants since we put them in the ground. It's been pretty overcast, and the tunnel's been closed up a number of days, so it's pretty humid in there. But I want to kind of point how the tips of these roots are really kind of naked. They don't have a lot of root adhesion. And to me, that's a good indication that we haven't got exudation really taking place. There's not a lot of sugars getting produced in these leaves, which probably isn't too surprising. These plants are pretty small, and they haven't really started to feed that root system quite as much. And you contrast the cilantro photograph with the spinach on the next page, which was taken in the same tunnel, a few beds apart, and you can see much stronger adhesion along these roots. The tips are the only spots that are bare in this. And so if you look between these two photographs, one of the ways that we have learned to read phosphorus in the fields, besides just general crop energy, is are we seeing that aggregation happening around the root systems? And if we are, that's generally a good indication that these plants are doing a good job of sharing their sugars and their other photosynthetic materials with the root systems, kind of feeding that biological area. As a general rule, people kind of call it dreadlocked roots. You want to look for these roots that have kind of strong characteristics of root adhesion. You don't want to see a lot of nakedness, especially as the plant is getting much more mature. I'm going to guess we're going to pick the cilantro up another week and take a look at it. I'm going to guess that part of this is just the fact that the plant's getting established. It's early in the growing season yet, and we've had only a couple of days of sunshine in the last week before today's sunshine was so blessed. So soil tests are a tool. We use them when we want to make a decision. Sometimes if you've been growing on a field for a decade, you probably have a pretty good idea of where your situation's at, and you can oftentimes get by with fertility decisions without using this tool. But especially for a new field, if you're taking on a new piece of land that you don't have a prior history with, soil testing can help you get kind of a guide to say, well, this is where I'm going to spend my money or my resources. If you're ever using a piece of land that you have concern around heavy metal toxicity, lead in urban areas or lead in former orchards, the UMass test is really useful to use because it gives extractable lead, gives you an idea of if it should be a concern going forward. And a lot of times these are used to maybe assess if you have a problem, what am I going to do to deal with the problem. over the years, we've really tried to spend a lot of time with crop observation. It's one of the things that we love about the scale that we're producing food on, is it's at a human scale. It allows us to really get out into the fields and take a look at things. And this slide is a picture of a zucchini plant in our greenhouse, or field house, planted out last May. And I put it up. This is the first year that I've ever grown zucchini in the field house. We're going to do it again here in 2018. I guess it says 2018, but it should say May 7th, 2017. That was a typo. We're not taking pictures from the future, obviously. And the zucchini experience last year that we had in our tunnel, they produced well, but they weren't phenomenal. And we saw some things with some fruit abortion that maybe were more common with hot temperatures, although we weren't keeping the temperatures up. And what we were sort of seeing is not really good fruit fill, and kind of almost indications of what we would attribute to boron deficiency. And so, soil testing might be a way to suss out if there's something deficient, but just because, in this case, boron tested fine in the soils, just because it's in the soils doesn't necessarily mean the mineral's functioning in the plant. In this case, we felt like we were probably keeping our tunnel closed up too much, and that humidity was really kind of minimizing the respiration rate of the plants. And the respiration rate helps to really impact the nutrient flow through the xylem. And if the respiration rate is really slowed down, especially where it's naturally slowed down with fruit and flowers anyways, that's where you might have some problems where the plants don't develop the full fruit. It's actually calcium deficiency in real time, but it's often because maybe boron isn't functioning to draw the calcium into the cell. So we're going to talk about a little bit of the basics of soil testing, math, very briefly. I don't want to get, as I mentioned, bogged down in mathematics because it can be daunting for folks, but just so we're on the same conversation line as we go forward. An acre furrow slice of top 6 inches of soil generally weighs 2 million pounds, and most soil labs either report information to you in pounds per acre or in parts per million, and you got the calculations there in front of you in terms of going each direction. But you want to keep in mind, if you're looking at a soil test, is this something that's reported to me in parts per million, or is it reported to me in pounds per acre? Because if you just look and you don't think what unit you're looking in, sometimes the numbers can throw you for a loop initially. So I'm going to pause for a second. I'm going to try to open up one of my PDFs of a recent soil test. This is a Logan Labs test, and one that we pulled last spring, and it's from one of our fields that we've sampled. We've been growing for almost a decade, probably 7 or 8 years. And the field has sample ideas A, B, and C, and these actually were soil tests that we pulled at different soil profiles. So the A was the 0 to 6 inch profile, the B was 7 to 12 inches, and the C was 13 to 18 inches. So last year was the first year that we sort of really wanted to look at what's happening not just in that top soil, but what's happening in the subsoil below. And not surprisingly, that this A horizon is the zone that had the most fertility. Really critically obvious if you look at the potassium here, where the pounds per acre, the values found in potassium was 238, whereas in the lower subsoils, you can see those numbers were under 100 pounds per acre. So I just want to bring this up for a moment so you can kind of see, for folks who haven't seen a soil test from Logan Labs, the way they report some of their metrics. Here's pounds per acre. You'd either see that as pounds per acre or parts per million, depending on which they're providing you with. They present their cations here with the desired value, the value found, and the deficit if there is any. So you can see on these soils, they all have excessive magnesium, excessive calcium to some degree, and deficiency in potassium, which is not uncommon for a lot of the fields in our neck of the woods that have been limed over the years. So going back to our presentation, to talk briefly about what is this cation exchange capacity that you a lot of times hear about with soil testing. And if you're on a chat function, feel free to type in kind of what levels of CEC you have in your garden. It might be kind of nice, or your fields, to get an idea of the folks in the room who has a real heavy soil or light soil. But you can think of a cation exchange capacity as really is your nutrient holding capacity of your soil as it pertains to the positively charged ions, the cations. And those nutrients are adsorbed, they're held onto in the soil by the clay and the humus and organic matter. So if you have a real sandy soil that has low levels of organic matter, you're going to have a low cation exchange capacity. If you have a heavy clay soil or high organic matter soil, you're going to have what's considered to be a heavy exchange capacity. The reality for most folks in New England is we often are kind of right on that border point maybe between a light and a heavy soil. A lot of soils in our neck of the woods are 8 and 9 and 10, 11, 12. It's not often until you get out to the Midwest where you'd see a naturally heavy soil, or the muck soils in New York State where you'd see an exchange capacity of 30 or 40. What this plays a role, if we go back to the soil test, is the exchange capacity. You can see of this Albrecht field that we had samples in the A horizon there. Our exchange capacity is 11.77. That's just generally kind of giving you an idea of how big is your bank account that you could possibly hold these calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium ions in your soil. And so it's an idea of basically the storage potential, and you can influence it over time both by creating clay and adding small amounts of clay amendments, and certainly by increasing your organic matter. Some math on this. I'm not going to spend a time on this slide, but it's more for reference for folks if they want to come back to it. But what I do want to stress when we're looking at this is you have these nutrients that are important for crops and important for humans, and the cations are the positively charged nutrients. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium are the four big ones in our soils in terms of really creating impact as growers. And the key when we're talking about this is going forward is the calcium and magnesium have 2 charges, positive, and the potassium and sodium have 1 positive charge. And that can make a difference for how these nutrients are held in the soils. It can be very difficult for the potassium that only has a single charge to knock off the calcium or the magnesium that has a double charge in these soils. And so this is one of the things, if you have a heavily limed soil that has high levels of calcium or high levels of magnesium, you have to find sometimes an alternative strategy for building potassium besides putting a potassium salt on. All right, I'm going to go through a couple more slides and then pause for a quick round of questions before we kind of push through on the organic matter conversation. So one thing to note, if you've used the Mehlich 3 test through Logan Labs, is the acids that they're using with that, it's a pretty strong acid, and it's going to dissolve any limestone that's been recently added. And the lab has no way of determining when it dissolves that limestone and finds a calcium ion, is no way to know if that calcium was adsorbed and was part of the soil or whether it was just sort of like a free piece of limestone sitting in that soil. So if you've limed your soils in the recent months and you use a Logan Labs test, it typically will going to give you a higher level of calcium than what your soil actually has, and it will often overestimate your cation exchange capacity. So you just want to have that as kind of an understanding. We often will recommend, not pulling soil samples if you're going to use Logan Labs, within 3 or 4 months of putting on a heavy application of lime. We're not talking about 300 or 400 pounds. We're talking about if you put a ton or 2 of lime on a field. Folks who have found their way to Logan Labs and the Mehlich test, a lot of times they're interested in this idea of nutrient balancing, which is the base cation saturation ratio, the acronym BCSR that you sometimes see. And this is the followers of William Albrecht have really kind of been pushing this for decades. And what they've found is that if you do a good job of finding the right balance of these cations, the calcium and magnesium, potassium ions in your soil, then you're going to have kind of optimum physical conditions for good plant growth. The key here is sometimes this base cation saturation ratio gets kind of thrown and stomped on in the dirt by the university folks, and it's partially because it's the balancing approach doesn't always work in every scenario. And I like to kind of describe this as eating a balanced diet. If we're trying to raise a family like we are at the house, and we provide our kids with a balanced diet, but we only give them a thimble full of food every meal, it's obviously not going to be enough to actually sustain their growth. And the same thing is true in a soil situation. If you have the correct balance, but all of your numbers are really low, you're not going to have enough of those materials, the minerals, to actually grow a crop. So as a general rule, if your CEC is less than 8, you're going to probably look at what's considered to be the sufficiency level of available nutrients as opposed to focusing too much on the balance. Because if you only focus on the balance, you're probably not going to provide enough of those nutrients. All right, let me pause for a split second and take a couple of questions if I have them. And what I'm going to mention here is this is the understanding phosphorus is probably one of the key aspects of why we've decided to start using the Logan Labs test, but also continue to use a University of Massachusetts test. And you got to keep in mind you can't necessarily compare each test to themselves. They're apples to oranges. They're using different types of acids. They're reporting information in different ways. But the Malick-free test that Logan Labs use typically gives very high levels for phosphorus if there's been kind of a history of phosphorus use or a history of livestock on the farm. And that's because it's able to dissolve the phosphorus bond, whether that's phosphorus that's bonded with calcium or iron or aluminum or some of these really hard phosphorus bonds that our plants might have a difficulty actually breaking apart, especially early in the growing season. And when we compare it to a University of Massachusetts soil test, they're using a weaker acid, and you can see their phosphorus numbers that they're reporting to you. It's a different scale entirely. You can't compare the apples to oranges. But the phosphorus levels on the UMass test typically correspond better with like what plants can actually access, especially early in the season. So I've got an example of two of our fields here. You can see this is one field that we've been mineralizing and following fertility programs for the last 8 years, and UMass is providing us with a phosphorus number of 16 parts per million. And then we have a field that we started growing on just 3 short years ago, and you can see the UMass test is giving us a phosphorus level of 6.6. So this is kind of a nice way to think about soil testing and looking about making decisions. You know, we know this is the case because we've grown crops on these fields and we've been able to observe that over the years. But if you hadn't, you know, you could go out and pull these samples in each field, and what it would give you the indication is this first field here, whoa, you know, we might not need to put a bunch of phosphorus on to grow a healthy crop, whereas our second field will give you a better idea that sure enough, we got to, you know, address the phosphorus issues if we're going to go kind of optimum production.
Derek, we do have a question that came in. It's concerning biochar. And the question is, do you know anything about how biochar may affect the nutrient storage potential? And will that also show up on the testing?
So I haven't personally done a lot of testing with biochar, but from my understanding, you're looking at a carbon source that has tremendous capacity to store and hold nutrients. And typically, biochars were going to increase your exchange capacity. There's different forms of biochar in terms of what the feedstocks are and whatnot. The challenge with biochar, if you just put raw biochar into a garden or a farm environment and it hasn't been charged, it's going to act like a nutrient sponge, and it's going to start to grab nutrients, and typically maybe at the expense of the crop that needs those nutrients in that cycle. So I think, you know, most people have been using char over the years have come to understand that you want to charge that char, whether it's with compost or whether it's with some other types of fertilizer. You want to make sure that you're not putting a sponge that's dry into your soil, but you want that sponge to kind of already be saturated a little bit. Growers on the Cape, I know there's folks that are following char production on the Cape, and have had a really good response, I think, partially because they're working such light sands that they do struggle with nutrient holding capacity. But I know Anna had mentioned there's going to be a workshop on biochar, one of the webinars coming up later this year, so that might be a nice place to kind of circle back with that conversation in April when we have the webinar in April. I forget the woman who's presenting that information, but the other big thing with biochar is it gets into the conversation of the biological. You know, it's creating an opportunity for not just the chemistry to take place, but it's creating a lot of nooks and crannies, and so I think there's tremendous value to that.
Mm-hmm. Another question is concerning phosphorus.
Yep.
How do we compare phosphorus as parts per million to phosphorus as a percentage of base saturation?
Yeah, so, you know, phosphorus is an anion, so it's not often considered in this base saturation percentages. It's kind of separately looked at entirely differently. There are some folks who follow a balancing approach. Michael Estera, who's written the book on the ideal soil, and he likes to see his phosphorus levels sort of equal to his potassium levels, which in that scenario is you have higher levels of potassium, you want to have higher levels of phosphorus in your soil. But for the most part, phosphorus, because it's an anion, it's not considered to be part of this base saturation where you're trying to look at ratios.
Okay. And one more question is concerning aluminum. I think it says here the aluminum content is 45. Is that a problem?
Yeah, in terms of which soil, that's, what type of soil test you're looking at. Here's the aluminum of 45, maybe that somebody might have seen on this test, or they have their own test. Especially if you do a Logan Labs test, because again, I mentioned, let me see if I can get this so it's not looking too crazy. Here you see aluminum numbers that are in the thousands of parts per million on these soils. When people first see these, they can go, oh man, because aluminum's toxic to plants. But fortunately, most aluminum is not readily available when you've limed the soil into a pH range that most kind of farms and gardens are trying to grow crops at. This soil's got a pH of 6.6 on this soil test. So this aluminum that's in that soil, a lot of it's not going to be plant available. The concern would be with aluminum toxicity is typically when you have a lower pH that can make it more available to you. That would probably be the bigger concern. As a general rule, and I don't know if this will play out, but we could kind of look at that, is you're going to see higher levels of aluminum in clays and in worn-out clays. So if you have a real light soil without a lot of clay, one that's maybe had heavy amounts of organic matter added to it, you typically see much lower levels of aluminum than you would see, on a soil that's got heavy clays, and sometimes those clays may be worn out from fertility. So if you look, I'm going to just scroll down. I think this soil test has a, this last slide here has the far right column, Vermont compost. So this was just a test where we threw the Vermont compost in a bag and sent it off, and you can see the Vermont compost aluminum that I'm highlighting right now, only 69 parts per million. It's not a clay-based soil. This is a high organic matter potting mix. There's not a lot of clay. So aluminum is one of the structural components to clays, and in New England, it's typically one of the things that over the years gets broken down as the clay molecules gets worked on by the weather. All right, I'm going to slide back over to the presentation.
Sure, and
ask one more question.
Yes, this is the last question, then we'll go to your next segment. Curtis is asking, would you use a soil food web bioassay?
Yeah, so there's definitely a place and a role for using biological testing, and it's kind of exciting. Recently I came across an article that was looking at kind of the frontier of DNA testing, where they might become maybe less expensive down the road to kind of do these soil food web assays. Again, I think of tools, soil testing is a tool to make informed fertility decisions. And the food web assay might help understand how are your management practices impacting the biological community. For example, what is your fungal versus bacterial balance? Do you have a lot of fungal hyphae that are active, that have good size to them, and so on and so forth. You're really going to use that test potentially if you're trying to make a management decision. A lot of times the biological assays, they're typically a little more expensive than the chemical tests, and they often will provide you with information that's sort of maybe a little bit more based on your management practices. And for that reason, I sort of feel like you can often gain that information through other ways of kind of observing your plants. I don't necessarily think they're not valuable. It's just I've sort of struggled myself to say, oh, we're going to spend the last time I looked, I feel like it was almost $150 to get that assay, because I didn't feel like it was going to provide me with enough information to really merit that expense. But that's just my personal opinion. It's not necessarily thinking they're not valuable for others. So we're jump back into a few more minerals, and then we'll talk about organic matter. So just going to highlight a couple of situations that we commonly see. So, a lot of times if folks have been using dolomitic limestone over the years, you see a real high level of magnesium that's been built up in the soil, and sometimes that can be above what the base saturation target is. And this is sort of a classic case where we might decide to use gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, to help balance that magnesium excess. What will happen, you put the calcium sulfate into the soil, over time the calcium and sulfur bonds will break apart, and then the sulfur has the possibility to bond with magnesium or sodium or some of these other cations in the soil. But if you have a lot of magnesium in the soil, it might be able to grab some of that magnesium, and then as water leaches through your soil, it can carry that magnesium out. And I'm going to highlight that just real quickly with our soil tests here, going back to the top with the Albrecht test. And you can see this, our magnesium levels in the top 6 inches, that's the A test here, is at 370, but the desired value is 335. The next one is at 347, the desired value is 247. And the next one is 305, but the desired value is 206. This might be easier to see when we look at base saturation. You can see in that top 6 inches of the soil, we've effectively brought our magnesium down to 13%, whereas the subsoils still have higher levels of magnesium. When we first started working this field, some of our magnesium levels were over 20%. And the concern with that is that you have more magnesium in your soil, it tends to tighten your soil, which can be a good thing if you need it to hold water, but it also can mean there's less oxygen, which slows down your microbial activity and can impact your sort of nitrogen function in your root systems of the plants. And so over the years, we've sort of been targeting this Albrecht approach that we're looking at a 70 to 72% calcium goal, 12 to 15% magnesium, and kind of looking towards more to 3 to 5% potassium. So if you take on a piece of land that's been limed a lot over the years, sometimes you come back with a really high level of magnesium, and oftentimes the management practice you're going to look at is to use this gypsum. One of the other places we sometimes see common deficiencies in New England are old, worn-out hay fields or fields that had silage corn grown on them, and especially if they have a lot of lime added over the years. The lime sort of occupies all the exchange spots with calcium or magnesium, and it makes it hard to keep your potassium levels high. And I got a test here that I can show. This comes from our friends at Round the Bend Farm in Dartmouth, and they've just taken on a piece of land adjacent to their property that was farmed conventionally, growing corn, maycombers, and a bunch of other veggies. And if you look on this soil test here, I'm going to slide all the way down to potassium on the right-hand side. You can see the value found of potassium pounds per acre here was only 53. If you're using sufficiency level available nutrients, you probably need at least 100 pounds of potassium to grow a decent crop, is a general rule of thumb. The potassium level is really deficient in this soil. And the problem with that is this is a soil that probably had historical uses of conventional fertilizer. Potassium chloride is most likely the nutrient they were using for potassium. And when you're putting the potassium salts on, whether it's potassium sulfate or potassium chloride, it's really difficult to build the potassium levels up when you have already got adequate levels of calcium and magnesium. So in this scenario is where we'd often make a recommendation to use some sort of organically bonded potassium, compost, manure. We're trialing this high potassium seaweed that for trail markets. You're basically trying to figure out something that's kind of have a stabilized form of potassium so that you're putting it into the soil. You're not just going to have it leach out with the rainfalls that we get every winter if you're on the coast or, in the summertime in other parts of the state. There was a question about a certain time of year that, is better than others to take soil tests. Typically, it's when you're going to be well-equipped to make decisions. We typically like to take soil tests either in the fall or early spring. We've done them in the early spring the last few years, primarily because we've just been too busy in the fall. So here's a picture of potassium, going back to this conversation of observation. This is red thumb fingerlings. They're very productive in terms of number of tubers can be set for every hill. This is a picture of a couple years ago, one of our hills in the early part of summer. And, you can look at the number of tubers there. And one of the ways you can judge potassium is, are the late set tubers that are in your potato hills, are they really sizing up over time? Or, if I came back, this is a test hill that we did in July. We weren't typically digging these potatoes till maybe the third or fourth week of August. And if we came back into the field and still saw all these smaller sized potatoes and they hadn't really fully sized up, it'd probably be an indication that what's happened is we've run out of potassium. Potassium really is critical for mobilizing the sugars and other nutrients getting into the tuber of those potatoes. And if you don't have enough of it, you're not really going to be able to reach your full yield potential. So, you can use a soil test to look at this, or you can go learn to read the field. You look at your K-loving crops, whether it's potatoes or tomatoes, beets, celery. These are all kind of well-known potassium lovers. If those crops are performing well, odds are your potassium levels are pretty good. You might not need a soil test to tell you that. If you're growing in a pasture situation, you might see clovers as a good sign of potassium and calcium. For gardeners or folks that use high levels of organic matter, heavy amounts of compost over the years, there's 3 nutrients that we often see still deficient on those soil tests for people that are using a high organic matter approach. One is sulfur, and it's partially because there's a question of how sulfur-rich the feedstock is. If it's just leaf matter, things like that, you might not have adequate sulfur from those materials that are going into your compost. Similarly, boron leaches quite readily, can be held by organic matter, but if it wasn't present in the materials that kind of form your high organic matter or your high compost, then your boron levels are sometimes a concern. And then the final one is copper, which gets tied up with organic matter. I mentioned this might be a good thing, but there's a lot of soil tests that I've looked at where you have high levels of organic matter but low levels of copper. And since we have Eva on the call tonight, I'm going to pick on her because I have a soil test from Eva. And this is one of her soil tests taken within the last couple of years. And you can see her organic matter's levels on these soil tests are 14, 19, 12, 16. They're, I almost think of them as manufactured soils because they've had a historical use of heavy amounts of compost, and they've really built up a terrific water and nutrient holding capacity. And if you look at some of these soils, the copper levels might still be below where our target range. We might look to try and target 4 to 5 parts per million of copper for most small-scale veg, and you can see, although she's built up a tremendous storehouse of organic matter, her copper levels are not necessarily come up with that. I'm going to pick on this next set of tests just to see if there's any difference in the next field. But yeah, a similar trend. And she's actually, I think, probably been putting a little bit of copper on it at some point over the years, so it's maybe come up a little bit more than others. But those are sort of 3 flash points that I always look at for a home gardener that's using a lot of compost, or a market garden that's used historical heavy amounts of compost. These are 3 of the nutrients that I always really like to emphasize. All right, so switching in gears before we end tonight to talk about nitrogen. There's tests you can do for nitrogen. You can do the pre-side dress nitrate test. It's been used a lot by conventional growers in the corn. You're going to pull those samples in season, pulling a 12-inch plug, and it gives you an idea of how much nitrate is going to be available throughout the growing season. Solvita's used a similar approach, looking more from biological activity and what sort of carbon dioxide is getting created in your soil to give you an idea of what sort of mineralization is going to take place. You could have handheld meters like a Cardi meter to do a sap analysis or tissue testing in the field. But one of the common proxies that we like to use for looking at organic matter, looking at nitrogen, is to use organic matter and using that percentage of organic matter in our soils to estimate the nitrogen release. And so I have a couple of examples to talk about this. And there was a question, briefly about how good the DIY labs are for testing this kind of information. To me, I feel like they're great for home gardeners that just want to kind of tinker. For most commercial growers, it's just a lot more efficient to work with private labs or university labs because they give you information very quickly. But we do use some of the handheld meters on the farm. We've played a little bit around with the Cardi potassium and nitrate meters, specifically in greenhouse production. But for the most part, if you're using a Lamont test, for example, it just can be a lot of work to get the same amount of information the lab can do for less work. But if you're kind of inclined towards that, it's not a bad thing to consider. All right, so here's organic matter. And I'm going to stress, organic matter can do a lot for you, but we're going to really stress today talking about water holding capacity and talking about nutrient holding capacity. Each 1% of increase in your topsoil is estimated to hold about 20,000 gallons of water. So, what that looks like in reality is, here's 4 hypothetical soils in New England. You might have a light sandy soil with not much biological activity. It might be a low organic matter of 3%. Our soils on our farm, are averaging more like 5%, and then you might have a garden or a farm that's really emphasized tillage practices and amendment practices that really increase the organic matter over time. Each of these organic matter percentages can hold different amounts of water, and so when you look at, if you're able to build up your organic matter at 7%, which would be terrific on a farm scale, field scale production, you're going to actually be able to hold more water, whether that's rainfall that's happening in the off season or that's rainfall coming within the growing season. And that's going to allow the biological activity to be more active in dry spells. It's also going to provide sort of a reservoir or a sponge during the course of the growing season when things dry out. The other thing we look at when we look at organic matter is this idea of estimated nitrogen release. And the formula varies, but as a general rule, most people feel like you get between 15 and 25 pounds of nitrogen to be released per season. And the factors are really dependent on soil temperature and moisture. So obviously, if you have a real dry summer and you're not irrigating, you're probably not going to get the full amount of release because you're not mineralizing that nitrogen that's in the organic matter. If you have a really cool summer or a cool spring, a lot of that mineralization is not going to take place. So if you're growing radishes, per se, in the spring, this nitrogen release maybe is not going to make a big difference for your radish crop. But for the long season crops, whether you're growing winter squash or tomatoes or potatoes and things like that, these organic matter percentages and the estimated nitrogen release can really help factor into your nutrient budgets. So we have sort of 4 different scenarios here, as we just outlined with the water holding capacity. And with these, the nitrogen release per percentage of organic matter, it's not necessarily linear. Typically what happens is as you build up your organic matter to these high levels, 9% or even higher, you're going to mineralize less because you just can't get the biological activity just isn't up to the job to mineralizing all that organic matter. It's almost like a buffet table that's just too big to take on. But as you can see, the trend here is, a lower organic matter soil is going to offer you less nitrogen than a higher organic matter soil. And this is, one of the tenets of organic farming historically has been to build organic matter, and one of the big benefits of that is not only the nutrient holding capacity and the biological activity that it encourages, but the mineralization of that organic matter every year is going to have a big impact in terms of the amount of nitrogen that's available to the crop that you're going to grow. Nitrogen sometimes gets put in this bad category because it's obviously maybe abused on a massive scale within conventional agriculture. But I think it's really critical when we think about growing food that we have an awareness, that we keep in mind that this nitrogen is everywhere. It's in every single cell of the plant. It's playing a big major role in the reproduction. So whether you're growing zucchini or potatoes or lunchbox peppers or the Portuguese kale, nitrogen is going to play a role in all of these. And a lot of farms, develop nitrogen budgets to get an idea of, how much nitrogen do I need to grow my crop. Typically those budgets are determined with your yield target in mind, because obviously if you want a higher yield, you're going to have more growth, you're going to have greater need for nitrogen. And they're often developed by looking at this organic matter mineralization that we just covered on the last page, looking at your credits from cover crops, any credits from biological activities, or if you have carryover nutrient release, i.e. if you've been putting on compost over the years. And what we found is over time you can learn your fields pretty well, and you get an idea. We have plenty of nitrogen to fill those potatoes and plenty of potassium to fill those potatoes, or this field's a little bit weaker. We need to kind of supercharge it if we're going to go for optimum and top yields. You have to be a little careful with nitrogen as a fertilizer because you put too much of it on, it can bring some negative things like water and flavor issues. But it's really important to keep in mind that if you don't have nitrogen, you're not going to have growth. We're going to wrap up with just a few pictures talking about this, different time of the year. And, I like to stress this, that, soils and crops growing throughout the seasons, they're functionally different in March if they're in a tunnel, as if they're in May, as if in their summertime. And from a fertility perspective, we can keep that in mind and potentially adjust our fertility program based on the growing season. So this is a photo of a lettuce a couple years ago, real good root growth. This is probably less than a week, 10 days after planting in an April relatively cool soil. And, one of the things we've always stressed is we make sure that the phosphorus is there in the springtime, whether you're using a liquid fertilizer like organic gem fish that's been stabilized with phosphorus, or whether you're using bone char or bone meal, one of the phosphorus fertilizers you're allowed to use. Phosphorus isn't really mobile in the springtime. It's never mobile, but it's not mobile in the springtime, and it's more critical then because the roots aren't growing as quickly, so not able to go and discover all the nooks and crannies of phosphorus in your soil. So typically the springtime is when you're going to get the biggest response from phosphorus fertilization. Now, we'll talk about that in a second, but you can do other things. You can create a microclimate, in this case using row cover to cover your kale plants early on to help elevate the soil temperature. You know, that's going to allow your root systems to grow quicker. It's going to allow those root systems to colonize spots and find that phosphorus that is in the soil much better than if they're in a cold environment. So I'm going to end with this example of a simple field test. And we do a lot of this to help us with observation on the farm. This is an example of using springtime phosphorus. The question is, does phosphorus fertilization improve spring crop growth in my fields? And one recommendation might be to split a bed before you seed it and apply phosphorus to half the bed, and don't apply phosphorus to the other half, and see what the response looks like. Here's a picture of our black summer choy from June of 2016, and you can see from this photograph, this is what we're looking for, right? We're looking for really abundant growth. We're going to, fill up lots of bellies with delicious choy. We're going to be able to rotate this crop out of the field and get our next crop going pretty quickly. So one way to do this on your scale, depending on where you're at, whether you're on field scale or small scale, is, here's a hypothetical, and maybe not choy, but pick a crop that you're growing a couple of beds of next to each other. It could be your spring lettuce or spring cabbage, and split those into 4 sections and trial different rates of bone char, 200 pounds, 400 pounds, 800 pounds to the acre in those different sections, and then get out there in the field and take a look and observe and see what that phosphorus application really does for you. Does it give you better crop energy? You can dig the plant up and you can look at the root systems. Are you seeing good adhesion, soil aggregation around those roots, or are you seeing really white, naked roots? Do you see, volume and speed of growth? That might be one way of getting you an idea of what are your phosphorus levels like in your soil. This is not using a soil test. This is using your plants and your time and your observation skills. You could corroborate that with a soil test if you want to pull it, but a lot of the soil testing that you do over time is it can kind of really just be something that complements everything else that you're doing on the farm to kind of assess your nutrient balances. The lettuce in summertime, this is a real quick picture, to remind us that, a summertime crop versus a springtime crop. So in the summer, we're probably not having to deal with phosphorus deficiencies quite as critically because the plants are growing root systems much quicker. But again, you could still kind of rip up a plant, take a look at that root system, get an idea. You get naked roots, or you're getting good root adhesion, which is kind of this indication of good sugar flow going into out of the roots. So real quick, there's a couple of labs on the lab pages that I screened on back in the past. Spectrum Analytic, there's a lot of different information on the web, but Spectrum Analytic is one of my favorite references for kind of learning about a lot of the principles behind soil testing. They have a ton of information in their library. This is just one of their cation exchange capacity articles. I encourage folks that would like to learn that way to check out their website. There's a few books here that I've linked, as well as Graham Sate's Nutritech company down in Australia, who does some terrific writing on these conversations. So this information will be archived on NOFA. I'm available to answer some questions for folks that want to continue to engage in the conversation, but for folks that aren't interested in that, I thank you for your time listening and hope everybody was able to get something out of the whirlwind presentation.
Thank you so much, Derek. That was a whirlwind. I'd like to see you when you're going a little slower. This was a wonderful presentation. Just 3 more questions, if you have time, from some of our viewers.
Yep.
There was a clarification on an earlier question concerning potassium. The viewer actually wanted to know if there was a correlation between potassium given as parts per million in the soil test and potassium given in the percent saturation list. The soil test that you show has potassium listed under base saturation.
Yeah, so the Logan Labs test will actually report the information in both pounds per acre or parts per million, and then also will report it as a base saturation percentage. And so the pounds per acre, the parts per million is often where you figure out how much I need to add, but the base saturation is typically, gives you a better idea of where my target is. So here you can see on this test that the target's between 2 and 5%. We'd actually like to have our potassium level up more towards 4 or 5%, but it takes a while to build it there, especially if you're taking large amounts of crop every year. The UMass test, they do this presentation a little bit differently. They have the potassium listed as parts per million. They also have it as base saturation, and then they also give you this nice interpretation, which is really just looking at all their tests that they've received over the years and where potassium is flowing with the exchange capacity. But you could see, a soil like this where it's been well fertilized by us for the last 7 or 8 years, and they're going to tell you that most crop nutrients are above optimum, versus one of our newer fields, and you can see the potassium here is right on the edge of very low to low.
Okay. Quick question here on what does tighten your soil mean? What did you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, so the magnesium versus the calcium ions. So the calcium ions has 2 positive charges, and the magnesium ions have 2 positive charges as well. But their hydrated radiuses are different, and the way it works is when you have magnesium in the soil, it actually will pull your soil particles together, and it will allow those particles to actually, we call it tighten up, but it's, imagine clay particles kind of stacking on top of themselves like a deck of cards. And the calcium molecule, because it's a little bit bigger when it's hydrated, it causes those clay molecules to what's called flocculate. And that flocculation would be almost like if you're building a house of cards instead of stacking them into a deck. If you think of a 52-card deck that sits into a deck versus a full house that you could build with it, when you build your soil with the right calcium levels, that flocculation that takes place allows airflow, allows pores to exist much better than when you tighten the soil with heavy applications of magnesium, which is the reality of the farms that have had dolomitic limestone applied over the decades.
Okay. And this is the last 2 questions here. The first one, how do you calculate mineralization of micronutrients from compost?
Well, if you're using compost from a commercial source, I always recommend that you have that compost tested. They should have that information and share that with you. And in fact, if you're a larger commercial grower, you'd be kind of required to have that information under the new nutrient management regulations. But, the compost that mineralizes over time, if it has trace minerals in that compost, it will release some of those over time. But if it doesn't have it to begin with, it's not going to release those. But as a general rule, we talked about nitrogen release and each percentage of organic matter releasing, on average between 15 and 25 pounds of nitrogen. Well, when it's releasing that nitrogen as the organic matter is being mineralized, it's also releasing sulfur, it's also releasing phosphorus, and it may be releasing some of the trace minerals. It may not be. What we've found over the years is most composts, leaf-based compost, urban compost, tend to bring high levels of zinc into your garden soils. You can see that with Eva's soil test where she had real good organic matter levels, and you can see her zinc levels here are in the 20 to 30 parts per million, much higher than what the background zinc levels are of a soil. This is a zinc in a field that's a mile away from Eva's that have zinc levels at 1 or 2 parts per million. So you oftentimes see the zinc levels come up quite a bit. That's probably the most common one. And then if you're working with compost that's coming from animal manures, if the animals have been feeding a lot of grain, you might get some of the things that are present in the grain. That could be the zinc, could be the boron, and other types of minerals like that.
Okay. And then our last question for the night, I know the questions are still coming in, and I'll give out your email. But how would you use the Brix scale to monitor nutrients?
Oh, that's a good question. So we named our farm Brix Bounty Farm. It was probably a little naive when we named the farm, but part of the approach was to kind of enter into the conversation that, the refractometer is often used to measure soluble liquids in a sap of a plant, and a lot of those are the resultant of photosynthesis. And they often get very much tied to like high phosphorus levels, meaning you can build more sugars in your crop, and then you can get higher Brix levels. I personally am backed off a little bit from the sense that like that high Brix guarantees a mineral output because you can get some false positives, and certainly if you were using analysis of the end product, your dehydration of your root of your carrot or your root or your beet might be able to give you a much higher level. So over the years, we haven't been using a refractometer to say that this guarantees this in terms of mineral output. But we have used it over the years is to get a better idea of, kind of going back to that phosphorus conversation, are we getting the sugars to build up in the plant? And we can see that sometimes, if we're looking at, say, potatoes or tomatoes, you can do refractometer readings in the late afternoon on, different points of the growing season and get a sense, certain crops, potatoes and tomatoes, are pretty easy to get high refractometer readings. So, if you can get a 16 or an 18 on a potato leaf in the afternoon, it's a good indication that you're having a lot of phosphorus mobilization, a lot of sugar production in that plant. You could then do a test in the morning time, and if your Brix levels haven't come down, that might be a warning sign that you're actually not getting the sugars to move out of the leaf like you would like to. So the refractometer can be a good tool to kind of look at both nutrient mobility and overall kind of productivity of your crop, but I don't think it's necessarily a good proxy for guarantee in terms of the mineral outcomes.
Okay. Well, wow, that was a great deal of information. I know the questions are still coming. And Derek, I want to thank you for your time tonight. I know we went a little bit over, and I appreciate your patience and your willingness to take that time. I do have your slides, and so for those who would like to see them, if you would send me, email me your email addresses, I will get those slides out to you, as well as this presentation will be up on the YouTube page by the end of the week. And I will also include that straight away to those who are interested in getting this presentation, both the video and the PowerPoint presentation. Derek, are you presenting at the summer conference this year?
No, I think I'm taking the summer off from presenting.
Oh.
We've got a lot going on.
Okay.
But I'll probably be back at the winter conference next January.
Yes, sir. All right. Well, it's well-deserved. And as you heard me mention, the summer conference this year, we're going back home to Hampshire College, August 10th through the 12th. Please go to the website for more information. Registration information will be forthcoming. And I'd like to thank everyone tonight for coming on the line. We had, at one point, approximately 21 people. And so I hope you were well fed with a great deal of information coming into the growing season. Derek's information and contact information is on this last slide. And you can reach him at derekchristianson@gmail.com. If you'd like further information, you can also reach me at anna@nofamass.org. So again, thank you so much for your time tonight. Have a great evening. Next month, look out. We're going to have Andrew Merford speaking about hoop houses and greenhouses, how to do simple techniques in those. Again, a great way to prepare for the season. Thank you so much. You all have a great night.